In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what we now know to be Mexico. Cortés and his small band of soldiers forged alliances with a series of tribes who resented the dominating Aztec Empire, the largest force in Mesoamerica. These alliances, combined with advanced European weaponry and devastating outbreaks of smallpox, allowed Cortés to topple the Aztec Empire by 1521. Tenochtitlan was destroyed, and its ruins were used to build Mexico City, which roughly translates to City of the Land of the War God, the capital of New Spain. It's often asked why New Spain, eventually the Mexican Empire, and later the United States of Mexico, didn't become a superpower like the United States of America would. Mexico had a massive, hardworking population, abundant natural resources, a strong, unified culture, plenty of coast, and the workforce and land for a manufacturing industry to emerge. The reasons as to why Mexico hasn't yet achieved superpower status per se actually date back to its founding. Under Spanish rule, the indios, or natives, were subjected to the encomienda system, a feudal-like structure where the Spanish and Austrian landowning elites controlled vast tracts of territory and used the natives as a labor force. Catholic missionaries were successful in converting millions of native Mexicans to Christianity and establishing missions across the territory, bringing with them education systems and the first infrastructure in New Spain. The Spanish colonial economy was essentially based on extracting natural resources, specifically silver, making Mexico one of the most important sources of wealth for the Spanish Empire, with silver mines in places like Zacatecas and Guanajuato enriching the Spanish crown. But this model left little room for individual economic mobility or innovation. By contrast, British colonial America had a decentralized land ownership model. In fact, many of the 13 colonies were actually land grants, most notably Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods, which was a charter colony of the Crown to William Penn. Because the British Crown didn't exert complete control over its colonies, whether by choice or circumstance, this allowed settlers, predominantly small-scale farmers, to own land, which fostered a burgeoning middle class and the so-called American individualist mindset, a society where economic power was more widely distributed. The colony's relatively egalitarian structures thus laid the groundwork for an entrepreneurial capitalist economy. And while the British colonies in North America developed diverse economies based on a mix of agriculture, trade, and manufacturing, New Spain focused almost solely again on resource extraction. When the Mexican War of Independence ravaged these mining regions, it left the fledgling country economically debilitated for decades. You see, about 150 years after the organization of New Spain in the late 18th century, the discontent of the mestizo and Indio populations, combined with the influence of the successful American Revolutionary War in the north and the weakening of Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, set the stage for a massive revolution against the Spanish crown. In 1810, Miguel Hidalgo, a Catholic priest, issued the Grito de Dolores, calling for an end to Spanish rule, redistribution of land, and racial equality, the beginning of the Mexican War of Independence. The conflict was long and brutal, and heroes like José María Morelos and Vicente Guerrero continued the fight after Hidalgo's execution in March of 1811. The fighting, as mentioned, devastated Mexico's silver mines and agricultural heartlands. By the time Mexico emerged as an independent nation in 1821, it was an economic ruin, with little infrastructure to rebuild its shattered economy and rampant inflation. The country inherited deeply divided regional loyalties and a legacy of caste and wealth gaps, complicating any efforts to establish a stable government. If we compare it to the American Revolution, which was relatively straightforward of a conflict, the Mexican War of Independence seems like a long, grinding, and brutal campaign. Although the American Revolutionary War disrupted colonial life, it didn't destroy the economic core of the Northeast or devastate its infrastructure or the agricultural heartlands in the South. Post-independence, the United States retained many of its colonial governing structures, adapting British legal and institutional frameworks into their new republican system. Mexico's independence struggle flipped the government a few times, first under the leadership of Agustín de Iturbide, who was a stabilizing force but ended up unintentionally exacerbating divisions among conservatives, liberals, and regionalists, causing chronic political instability, with frequent coups and counter-coups all sort of building up to the campaigns of Santa Anna and his bushel of instability in national mythos. But then eventually, after the Santa Anna period, in one of the most consequential events of the North American 19th century, Mexico lost half of its territory to the United States. In 1836, Texas, which was then a Mexican territory, mostly inhabited by Germans, Scots-Irish, and Anglo-Americans, declared independence. This was followed by the Mexican-American War, during which the United States invaded Mexico and actually captured Mexico City. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico ceded present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming over to the Americans, something that even today is a sort of stain on the diplomatic relations between the two countries. The internal instability that followed this made Mexico vulnerable to foreign intervention. In 1860s, while the US was busy with their own civil war, France, under Emperor Napoleon III, installed Austrian Archduke Maximilian as Mexico's emperor, with the support of Mexican conservatives. However, liberal leader Benito Juárez resisted the imperial rule, and Maximilian was eventually overthrown and executed in 1867, restoring the Republic. Then, from 1876 to 1911, Mexico was ruled by Porfirio Diaz, a military general who brought political stability and economic modernization at the cost of Republican institutions. But even though historically this period can be considered a dictatorship, generally the Porfiriato is viewed favorably by Mexicans and Mexican historians. He's been described as a benevolent dictator, under whose rule Mexico saw significant investments in railroads, mining, oil production, and foreign investors flocked to the country. Cities like Mexico City underwent modernization. But of course, there were many who disliked the heavy hand of Diaz. Under his administration, land was increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few elites, leaving a lot of the lower classes landless and impoverished, and political dissent was of course suppressed, which essentially led to an alienation of the poor. And with an alienated, disaffected group with nothing to lose, there comes violence. The Mexican Revolution erupted in 1910 when Francisco Madero challenged Diaz's re-election in what has historically been documented to be a rigged election. What began as a political revolt quickly turned into a broad social revolution, with figures like Emiliano Zapata seeking land reform and rights for the poor, and the decade-long conflict resulted in over 1 million deaths and widespread destruction, and kept Mexico out of the First World War. The revolution culminated in the Mexican Constitution of 1917, which remains in effect as of 2024. It established progressive labor laws, land reform, restrictions on the Catholic Church, but the promises of the revolution were not fully realized, as power soon consolidated under a new political elite. And after decades and decades of ineffectiveness, the vacuum of authority in Mexico came to be inhabited by the cartels, highly armed, organized criminal groups who smuggle drugs around Central and North America and essentially control and cripple the Mexican states to this very day. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Mexico, rather than the United States, became the superpower of North America? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, consider joining the channel or submitting a scenario in our official Discord server linked below. Thanks, and enjoy the video. The Bourbon reforms implemented under Spanish King Charles III during the mid-18th century aimed to modernize and consolidate Spain's colonial empire. For New Spain, or Mexico, this meant increased taxation, stricter trade monopolies, and political centralization, all of which severely alienated the Criollo elite, the Spanish-descended landowners born in the Americas. The reforms undermined their economic autonomy and limited their access to political power, putting it all essentially in the hands of the Peninsulares, or Spaniards born in Spain proper, sowing deep resentment among a group that had essentially historically saw themselves as the natural rulers of New Spain. In our history, this discontent caused some localized rebellions, but without the context of the American Revolution, the Criollos would not go so far as to declare independence in response to these troubles until about the early 1800s. But this time, let's say, things are different. If we assume that the Bourbon reforms actually result in a Criollo revolution, Mexico might be in a better position once it's gained its independence. Adding to this anti-Bourbon discontent was the 1767 Jesuit expulsion, which stripped many Criollo families of the trusted Jesuit educators and really the community cornerstones that were Jesuit institutions in Mexico. The Catholic Church certainly didn't have the influence that it had 100 to 200 years ago, but in Mexico, it retained enough power to feel slighted by the Spanish crown's authoritarian overreach and cause an uproar. So let's assume that by 1768, the discontent would reach a boiling point, and, fueled by perhaps some Jesuit resources, the Mexican Criollos would begin a revolution to secure their authority, their land, and their influence over the vast resources of New Spain. The British at this time would just be coming out of a victory in the 7 Years' War, and delighted at another chance to weaken its rival Spain and expand its influence in the Americas, would come to support the Mexican revolutionaries. Here we'd see something of a reversal of the American Revolutionary War we know. The British, in this instance, are supporting a revolutionary force in the Americas to overthrow colonial chains, and the Spanish, and of course their ally in the French, would be fighting to maintain the imperial status quo. The stakes for Spain are certainly great. New Spain is the crown jewel of its empire, a vital source of specifically silver. But Spain's diminished power in Europe after the War of Spanish Succession and its inability to fully control its vast territories would leave it vulnerable to attacks from Britain's pan-Atlantic and skilled navy. The French are also by this point already overstretched from their loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War, but they would undoubtedly provide significant support to the Spanish. The war itself, if we were to take it realistically, would be really long and really protracted. The French Navy was undergoing modernization and could put up a formidable fight. The Spanish Navy, likewise, was not completely decimated by the 7 Years' War, and could likely defend their colonies in New Spain, especially since Britain didn't really have an in to the Gulf of Mexico except via Belize or Jamaica, or even the Bahamas. So it's likely that with the military circumstances of this period, Britain and Mexico in a realistic fight might actually lose to Spain and France. But of course, for the sake of our scenario, we'll be assuming that Mexico will emerge victorious and formally gain its independence by one means or another. The newly independent Republic of Mexico will now essentially be, to start, an extension of British power in the Americas. Mexican institutions will be modeled after the British and Dutch systems, with a parliamentary system to retain the Criollos' influence via an upper house akin to the House of Lords, but also a lower house to maintain continuity with the other castes. With British influence, it's also possible that the casta system will be eroded over time, though with how deeply ingrained these shadows are to this day, it's not necessarily a given. Nonetheless, the Republic of Mexico will now begin its life in an enviable geopolitical position in North America. Because Mexico retains control over the Louisiana Territory, it will now leverage control over the Mississippi River, a critical economic artery across North America and into allied British trade hubs in the north, and also New Orleans, a thriving port city on the Gulf Coast. And then of course Mexico will have the vast agricultural and mineral wealth that are the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, the bread and mineral basket of the plurality of the modern United States. With British backing, Mexico will be able to slowly, over time, develop trade networks along the Mississippi, exporting raw materials to Britain and importing processed goods like clothing, furniture, tools, tea, and the like. But with all of this valuable farmland and coastal metropolis and valuable inland mineral wealth will come a series of demographic challenges. Mexico's young government will first have to face the hurdle of consolidating its massive and diverse territory. Unlike the United States, which formed with at least initially a relatively homogeneous Anglo-Protestant identity, Mexico, in this state, will encompass a far more heterogeneous population of course, the Criollos and Peninsulares, the dominant class, albeit a racial minority, who view themselves as the stewards of the new republic. There's the mestizos, the mixed-race majority of New Spain, who, at least in Mexico proper, would form the backbone of labor and agriculture. The European settlers, French and Germans, who inhabited Texas and the Louisiana Territory, especially New Orleans, and also Anglo-American traders and farmers who will begin to inhabit the so-called virgin land of the Louisiana Territory. And finally, there will be the native tribes of North America, who will still inhabit most of Mexico's northern lands. British views on native rights in the Americas, which were laughably the mirror opposite of their views in terms of their later colonization of Africa and India, could perhaps motivate Mexico to preserve native dominion over some of these lands around what we now call the Dakotas, Montana, or Wyoming. But with the racial views of the Criollos, this is also not a given. Regardless, the revolution would basically set the stage for the concept of a Mexican national identity, with, of course, the Criollos viewing themselves as sort of stewards of the rest of the country, a benevolent aristocracy who will govern better than the Spanish, given their legitimate ties to the land and the blood and the people. It will come as no surprise, then, that this identity may fall upon less open ears in the north, where the settlers of Louisiana and Texas and the natives therein never really asked for a revolution against Spanish control, as they were fine doing their own thing without really any oversight from any central body. But moving on to the boring stuff, economically, Mexico will have to work on infrastructure development in its initial years, something the Americans kind of had to do the further south and west you went, but which wasn't as massive an undertaking as it will be in Mexico. They're going to have to build up new institutions and infrastructure really from the ground up, particularly along the Mississippi River, but also, of course, in Mexico City, Veracruz, and New Orleans, perhaps even starting new metro areas along the Gulf Coast and Texas along the way. Agricultural production will, over the decades, see a boost as wheat, corn, and sugar are cultivated in Louisiana, while central Mexico continues to dominate silver mining, providing financial stability. New Orleans might actually end up being the New York City of Mexico, ironically enough, if the swamps can be tamed and the Gulf weather doesn't constantly erode its ability to sustain itself. The city would be developing an interesting, unique culture. As more Mexican businessmen and people arrive in the city, it would lose its French plurality, but likely not its character. Just as New Orleans remains a sort of cultural anomaly in the United States, the Mexicans living in the city would preserve its French cultural heritage just through a Mexican lens rather than an American one. But something we haven't mentioned yet are the immediate effects on Mexico's independence just to its east. While British support would enable Mexico's statehood to begin, it will also inevitably strain Britain's resources. The success of the Mexican Revolution might just inspire colonial dissent in British North America, leading to an American Revolution in the 1770s, just as in our own timeline. Now, the French and Spanish would also be exhausted by fighting by this point, and it's unlikely that Mexico would be intervening in this conflict given the need to stabilize and consolidate their young state. So because of this, it's more likely than not that the American Revolution would actually fail. And the United States of America, as we know it, if this revolution were even to occur, would not come into existence, simply due to a lack of Spanish and French aid, and newfound British naval and infantry experience in the Americas. But it would leave Britain now even more drained than in her own timeline, just as the French and Spanish are also facing financial exhaustion. And of course, in the case of the French, this exhaustion would cause a revolution. The French Revolution, erupting in 1789, would upend the Ancien regime, replacing monarchy with a republican reign of terror and triggering waves of revolutionary fervor across Europe. For the sake of simplicity, we'll simply assume the French Revolution essentially occurs as it had in our own history, culminating in the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the First French Empire. The exhaustion during these waning decades of the 18th century and the early 19th century also would bear the crumbling of Spanish dominance in South America. Revolutionary movements would sweep across the continent, from Simón Bolívar to José de San Martín, fracturing Spain's American empire and reducing it to a tenuous hold over Cuba and Puerto Rico. Though these events would certainly cause a lot of discussion within the Mexican parliament and among the newspapers and the people of Mexico, the nation would reasonably refrain from involving itself in these American revolutions, because for now, internal stability and economic recovery were the priority. While Spain's influence in the Americas is waning by this point, Mexico would, of course, be grappling with the challenge of Anglo-American settlers moving into Louisiana territory. So the vast, fertile Great Plains of the region in our history provided essentially an irresistible lure to American farmers, adventurers, cartographers, and settlers. Now, the British already maintained military and political efforts to dissuade migration across the Appalachian Mountains into the Louisiana Territory, citing their treaties with Native American tribes and, of course, their alliance with Mexico. But nonetheless, there would be a wave, one way or another, of Anglo-American settlers into the Great Plains. Anyway, while this issue was propagating in northern Mexico, Napoleon would be busy occupying the Iberian Peninsula and, by extension, Spain. The Napoleonic Wars would probably actually be quite the legitimizing force for the Mexican Republic. During this period, it's not out of the question that Mexico would negotiate treaties to formalize its northern borders with British Canada and the Central American Republic in the southwest. The continental system and Napoleon's blockade would force Mexico to undergo industrialization in order to support itself. British and Dutch advisors would be brought in, not unlike in the case of the Empire of Brazil, to establish textile mills in Veracruz and Monterrey. New Orleans would continue to grow in vitality as a port city, essentially coming to rival Mexico City in cultural and financial importance. And with industrialization, inevitably came the need to answer the social question. Efforts to appease the mestizo majority would pass towards the end of the 1820s, including limited land reforms and redistributing underutilized Criollo lands to smallholders in agricultural regions. By the 1840s, we'd see a sense of Mexican manifest destiny take root. Both the political elites and the farming class alike were very keen on the idea of consolidating their control over the sparsely populated but land and resource-rich northern territories in order to both expand their agricultural sector, but also assimilate these territories properly and prevent potential Anglo-American minority from taking root. This expansionist ambition would also probably extend to Cuba, where Mexico would begin asserting claims, provoking tensions with Spain. Ultimately, we would see something of a Mexican-Spanish War be fought, ending in a narrow Mexican victory and causing a decade of naval reform to occur in Mexico, with the Mexican military finding that their naval technology was lagging behind that of the European world. However, at the same time, Mexico's relationship with Britain would begin to strain. Mexico's assertiveness in renegotiating trade agreements to favor its growing industrial sector, coupled with increased hostility towards the Anglo-American settlers in the Great Plains, but not much would come of this just yet. The mid-19th century would see significant social and political changes within Mexico. The growing mestizo middle class, buoyed by industrialization and trade, began to challenge the Criollo-dominated political system. This is sort of the trend that we'll be seeing throughout Mexican history, logically. The mestizo gain an inch, they gain an inch, they gain an inch, and the Criollo continue to become less of a domineering political force in the Mexican Republic. Political reforms in the 1850s would likely weaken the upper house's control over policy, granting greater representation to the mestizo majority, who essentially had majority in the lower house of parliament. The remnants of the casta system would be wholly legally abolished, but not without resistance and slight unrest. The tides of the Industrial Revolution would transform the economy, with railroads connecting New Orleans, Mexico City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Barrio, which we know to be Houston. Silver mining remains vital, but textiles, steel, agriculture would all grow in their share of Mexico's economy, and by the late 19th century, Mexico would have solidified its position as essentially the dominant economic power in the Americas, discounting the British Empire. However, its growing power would lead to a rift with Britain. Mexican expansionist ambitions in the Caribbean, their annexation of Cuba, would be seen as a threat to Belize, Jamaica, Bahamas, and Florida, all of which were British territories at this time, and this would lead to something of a Gulf War in the 1880s. In the Gulf of Mexico, of course. This brief but intense naval conflict would end in a stalemate, with the Treaty of Havana in 1884 establishing spheres of influence in North America. Essentially, this timeline's version of the War of 1812. Mexico would retain control over the Western Caribbean, while Britain would maintain dominance in Canada, British America, and the Eastern Caribbean. But this hiccup wouldn't stop Mexican economic development. 4 years later, New Orleans, the Paris of the Americas, would host the 1888 World Exposition. The peso trade at this time, fueled by Mexican dominance in silver production, would link Mexico to East Asian silver markets, especially in China. Mexico would be an industrial powerhouse, though one facing internal issues of stability, but these issues would soon be overshadowed. In June of 1914, Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand would be assassinated in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. Austria-Hungary, having received a blank check from the German Empire, would declare war on Serbia after Serbia's refusal to allow an Austrian investigation of the assassination. This would lead to the Russian Empire declaring war on Austria-Hungary, causing Germany to declare war on Russia, causing France to declare war on Germany, and pulling Europe's many alliances into the Great War. The Republic of Mexico would initially declare neutrality. After all, Mexico is far removed from petty European squabbles. However, due to Mexico's trade relationship with the British, which had been strained by the Gulf War but was still in full swing as an economic necessity, German U-boats would begin harassing Mexican merchant ships suspected of providing aid to the Entente. Their suspicions would not be entirely inaccurate either. The British had begun covertly encouraging the Mexicans through both news propaganda campaigns and political levers to aid them as a supplier of raw materials, particularly oil, which had fueled their war effort. But by 1915, the economic entanglement with Britain would become hard to disguise. German spies found that Mexican tankers were ferrying oil to British refineries in the Caribbean, and that Mexican ports along the Gulf Coast hosted British supply ships. This would cause an uptick in U-boat incidents in order to dissuade Mexico's assistance to the British. But the bounties of war profiteering would be too lucrative for Mexican merchants to deny. These dangerous encroachments on both sides would result in disaster. In 1917, the SS Extremadura, a luxurious Mexican liner built in Britain but proudly flying the Mexican flag, departed Veracruz, bound for Liverpool, carrying diplomats, wealthy elites, and civilians. In March of 1917, off the coast of Ireland, the Extremadura would be torpedoed by a German U-boat, suspecting the ship to be carrying oil and ammunitions for the British war effort. The attack was swift and ruthless, with the ship sinking within an hour. Among the 1,200 dead were prominent Mexican politicians, British dignitaries, and worst of all, child civilians. The German Navy would publicly claim the ship was carrying munitions for the British, but the dead unwittingly sealed the Mexican public's opinion. Mexican newspapers would call it an act of barbarism. The parliament would convene in an emergency session, and war would be declared. Let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.